I never imagined that my career as a lawyer would lead me to face something so dark. I always thought the most complicated part of my job would be dealing with endless piles of paperwork or convincing a judge that my client wasn't guilty. But life, or perhaps fate, had other plans for me, and it all began with an unexpected visit from a priest. My name is Javier, and I've been working as a lawyer in Mexico City for over 5 years. My specialty has always been insurance defense. Cases of people suing companies for compensation or resolving minor disputes. The usual stuff, nothing out of the ordinary. However, one day I received a visit from a priest, Father Tomas, from a nearby parish. It wasn't unusual for the church to have legal problems, but what he brought me that day changed my life forever. Father Tomas arrived at my office with an urgency in his eyes that I had never seen before. He told me about a parishioner, a humble man named Don Manuel, who was in trouble. It wasn't financial trouble, nor a land or property dispute. No, the man was convinced that he had broken a contract, a pact. But it wasn't just any pact. According to the priest's words, it was a pact with the devil. At first, I couldn't help but feel skeptical. A pact with the devil in the 21st century? The idea sounded ridiculous. But the priest, with a look as serious as death itself, assured me that Don Manuel fervently believed what he was saying. "Please help him," he asked me. And although it all sounded like superstition, something inside me told me I had to accept. 2 days later, I found myself on my way to a courthouse I had never been to before. The hearing was scheduled in the mysterious courtroom 66, in an old, rundown building in the city center. The strange thing was that, although I had worked in various courthouses throughout my career, I had never heard of that particular courtroom. But there it was, on the 6th floor of a building that seemed out of place, as if time hadn't passed through it for decades. When I arrived, I was met by a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. The place was almost empty, except for a few guards, who seemed more like shadows than real people. "Courtroom 66, I said quietly, looking at the number carved into the old, dark wooden door. I entered. The inside of the courtroom was similar to others, but something didn't fit. It was as if the very air was charged with something different. On one side, I saw Don Manuel, an elderly man trembling with fear. On the other side, a tall, elegant man in an impeccable black suit shot me a smile that chilled my blood. "Good afternoon," he said in a voice so soft it almost seemed like a whisper. "I'm glad you came." This man was not just any lawyer. Something about him deeply disturbed me, but I couldn't identify what it was. As the hearing began, the judge entered, a stout man with a severe face who barely looked up as he took his seat. "Let's begin," he said in a deep voice that resonated throughout the room. The opposing counsel, or rather the man representing the other party, presented a document. It was a contract, a pact between Don Manuel and someone whose name was blurred, illegible. "My client," he said with that voice that kept echoing in my ears, "only wants the agreement to be fulfilled. The payment has already been received. Now only the delivery remains to be completed." I looked at Don Manuel and saw the panic in his eyes. I tried to intervene, arguing that the contract was void, that no one could sell their soul or another's, but my words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The judge didn't flinch, nor did the lawyer. It was then that I knew I wasn't in an ordinary court. This was something much darker. "The contract is clear," said the judge. "Don Manuel must fulfill his part." Before I could say anything more, Don Manuel stood up with tears in his eyes. "Please don't do this," he begged, but his voice was choked in the sepulchral silence of the room. It was then that I understood the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just a trial. It was a verdict that had already been decided before it began. I was facing something beyond the human, something that didn't follow the laws I knew. The hearing ended quickly. The judge ruled that Don Manuel must fulfill the pact, and before I could do anything, I saw two court officers, huge as mountains, approach and take Don Manuel away, dragging him towards a door at the back of the room. "Where are you taking him?" I shouted, but no one answered. The door slammed shut, and suddenly it was all over. The room was left empty, as if nothing had happened. I left the courthouse with my head full of questions and a feeling of emptiness in my chest. I didn't understand what I had seen or experienced, but I knew it wasn't normal. Courtroom 66, that courthouse, was not an ordinary place, and the man I had seen, that lawyer, was not human. I was sure of that. That was the first time I faced something like that, and although I didn't know what the future held for me, I knew I had been dragged into a world I didn't understand. A world where pacts with the devil were real and courts followed rules that defied logic. That was just the first of many hearings that would change my life forever. After that first experience in courtroom 66, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Don Manuel's case tormented me, not only because of the unusualness of the process, but because of the finality of the outcome. Had I really witnessed two officers, almost beasts, taking a man away for breaking a pact with the devil? A few weeks passed without anything strange happening. I convinced myself that maybe I had imagined it all, that perhaps it had been a kind of bad dream, something born of stress and accumulated work. However, I soon received another call. This time it was directly from a priest from a town outside the city. Father Gregorio spoke to me with a tone of urgency, and what he said sent a chill down my spine. "Javier, I need you to come. There's a man who says he made a pact, and he's desperate. He's convinced that he will come for him." I was struck by how calm he sounded, as if he had dealt with this kind of thing before. I accepted the invitation, and the next day I headed to the small town on the outskirts of Puebla. When I arrived, Father Gregorio was waiting for me at the church door. He had a worried expression, but not of fear, more of resignation. "He's inside," he said, pointing towards the church. "He says his trial is tomorrow." That phrase hit me immediately. His trial? Could this be another one of those cases, like Don Manuel's? I entered the church and saw a man sitting on one of the pews, his head in his hands. He looked exhausted, as if he hadn't slept in days. Father Gregorio introduced him as Juan Garcia, a local farmer who, according to him, had made a pact 5 years ago. Hearing this, I felt a knot in my stomach. "Juan, what kind of pact did you make?" I asked, trying to sound as calm as possible, although my mind was full of unease. Juan looked up. His eyes were red, as if he had been crying. "I made a deal to save my wife," he murmured. "She was sick on the verge of death, and I didn't know what else to do. A man appeared. He told me he could save her in exchange for my soul. I didn't think about the consequences. I just wanted her to live." There it was again! The man who appears in moments of desperation, offering the impossible in exchange for something incalculable. This was no coincidence. "And now what happens?" I asked. "Why are you so sure the trial is tomorrow?" One sighed, as if gathering all his courage to answer. "He came yesterday. He told me the time was up, and I had to appear in court. He gave me the address. It's in courtroom 66, in the capital." I felt a shiver run down my spine. Courtroom 66. The same place where I had witnessed Don Manuel's hearing. Was it possible that this courtroom existed in more than one place? Or was it destined to appear only for those who had made these pacts? The next day we left for Mexico City. Juan was silent for most of the trip, and I didn't know what else to say to him. It was clear I didn't fully understand what he had gotten into, but I felt the weight of what was coming. Upon arriving at the building that housed courtroom 66, the atmosphere turned gloomy, almost oppressive. The guards at the entrance looked at me as if they already knew who I was and why I was there. We entered the building, and to my surprise, there it was again, courtroom 66 on the 6th floor. Not much time had passed since the last time I was there, but everything seemed the same. The same dark wooden door, the same dense air that made each breath heavier than the last. The layout of the courtroom was the same, but this time there were more people. The man in the black suit, whom I immediately recognized as the opposing counsel, was already there, with the same sinister smile on his face. His presence radiated confidence, as if he knew he had already won the case before it even began. Beside him, two intimidating-looking officers stood motionless like statues, with the same threatening gazes I had seen before. Judge Bryan entered shortly after, with his usual air of authority. There were no introductions or formal greetings. He simply sat down and began the proceedings. "Mr. Garcia," said the judge in a dry tone, "your contract is here, clear as day. You accepted the terms, and now the time has come. Do you have anything to say in your defense before I pronounce the verdict?" Juan, trembling, could barely respond. "I just wanted to save my wife. I didn't know." The opposing counsel interrupted. "Ignorance of the law is no excuse, Your Honor. My client fulfilled his part of the deal, and now it is time for Mr. Garcia to fulfill his." I felt a growing anger, but also an overwhelming helplessness. It was the same cycle over and over. I tried to intervene, arguing that the contract was inhumane, that no one can sell their soul like that. But my objection was met with the same disdain as always. "We are not here to discuss the morality of the deal, counselor," replied Judge Bryan, his cold, penetrating gaze fixed on me. "We are here to enforce the law." The verdict was swift and, as I had feared, unfavorable. The officers approached Juan, grabbing him by the arms with controlled brutality. "No, please!" he shouted, but his plea fell on deaf ears. They dragged him towards the same door at the back of the room, the one that led to a place I knew, deep down, he would not return from. When the door closed, the silence in the room was deafening. I knew there was nothing more I could do. I left the courthouse with a sense of defeat unlike anything I had experienced before. Father Gregorio was waiting for me outside. When he saw my expression, he understood what had happened. "I'm sorry, my son," he murmured. "These pacts are always like this. There's no way to avoid what is predestined." From that moment on, I knew I was trapped in something much bigger than I could have ever imagined. Courtroom 66, the devil's lawyer, the judges, everything was part of a system I couldn't escape. After that second case, doubts and fears began to haunt me constantly. I found myself trapped in a kind of infernal cycle from which I could not escape. Every time I tried to put my life in order, a new case related to courtroom 66 would come to me, as if an invisible force was pushing me towards that abyss. It was shortly after Juan Garcia's trial that I received a call from Father Andres, a priest from a small town in Oaxaca. His tone was serious but more reserved than the previous ones. He told me about a young woman named Carmen who, according to him, had made a pact with the devil to save her sick mother's life. When I heard that, a mix of resignation and despair invaded me. Again the same thing. Another life trapped in an impossible deal. Carmen was not like my other clients. She was barely 25 years old, but seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. I met her at Father Andres' parish, a small church in the middle of the Oaxacan mountains. Her large, dark eyes reflected a deep pain, one I had rarely seen in my years of work. "I didn't want to do it," she told me when we sat down to talk. "But my mother was dying. We were desperate. We had no money to pay for a hospital or doctors who could save her. He appeared one night when I was crying by my mother's bed. He told me he could help me, that he could save her in exchange for something. I knew what was coming. Carmen, like the others, had made the deal. She wasn't sure of the time frame or the exact terms, only that her mother's health miraculously improved the next day. However, now, after several years, the man had returned. He had told her that her time was running out, that she had to appear in court in 3 days. I took the case, although I felt increasingly powerless. I knew how it would end. I had seen it before. But something about Carmen moved me deeply. There was a purity in her intentions, a goodness in her heart that distinguished her from my other clients, many of whom had acted out of greed or resentment. Carmen had only wanted to save her mother. We traveled together to Mexico City to face the trial. This time, the trip was quieter than ever. Carmen didn't talk much, but her silence said it all. I could see the fear on her face, but also an unwavering determination. She knew the end was near, but she was ready to face it. When we arrived at the building housing courtroom 66, everything seemed the same as the previous times. The guards at the entrance, the heavy, dense air, and that strange feeling that something dark was watching us from the shadows. We went up to the 6th floor, and as always, the door to courtroom 66 awaited us, old and dark, as if it had been there since time immemorial. The courtroom was just as gloomy, but this time something seemed different. The opposing counsel, the same man in the black suit, who was always present in these cases, shot me an even more unsettling smile than usual. He knew something I didn't. Judge Bryan made his entrance, followed by the same 2 officers as always, those enormous beings who seemed more beasts than humans. The hearing began quickly, without ceremony, without preamble. Everything seemed a repetition of the previous cases. "Carmen," said the judge in his deep voice, "you made a deal, and now it is time to fulfill your part. Do you have anything to say before I pronounce the verdict?" Carmen, with her head held high, responded in a firm voice that surprised me. "I only wanted to save my mother. If that was a mistake, I accept it. But I don't regret saving her." The opposing counsel rose from his seat and spoke in that soft voice that always unsettled me. "My client fulfilled his part of the deal, Your Honor. He saved Carmen's mother, just as he promised. Now it is time for her to pay what she owes." I knew any attempt to argue would be futile, but I had to try. I stood up and explained that the pact had been made in a moment of desperation, that Carmen was not fully aware of what she was doing, and that she could not understand the consequences of such a dark contract. But, as in the previous trials, my words had no effect. "This court is not here to discuss the intentions behind the pacts," said Judge Bryan, without even looking at me. "We are only here to enforce what was agreed upon." The officers began to move towards Carmen. I felt a despair growing inside me. This time, I couldn't let them take her away. This time I had to do something. I stood up and, with more courage than I felt, shouted, "This isn't fair. You can't take her. She only wanted to save her mother. She doesn't deserve this fate." The courtroom fell silent for a moment. Everyone, even the judge, seemed surprised by my outburst. It was then that the opposing counsel, with his smile, approached the bench and said, "If the defense attorney is so interested in his client, perhaps we should make a new offer." I fell silent. What did he mean by that? Judge Bryan looked up, intrigued, and asked me, "Are you willing to negotiate, counselor?" I felt a lump in my throat. I didn't know what was at stake, but something told me it wasn't an ordinary offer. "Negotiate what?" I asked, trying to maintain my composure. The opposing counsel looked at me with those cold, empty eyes. "Your client is already destined to fulfill her part of the deal. But if you truly wish to save her, you could offer something in exchange. My mind began to race. What could I offer? What kind of deal did they want me to make? And then I understood. They wanted something from me. They wanted my own soul in exchange for Carmen's. Judge Brian, with an expression that almost seemed amused, waited for my response. I knew this was a test, a temptation. If I accepted, I would drag myself into that abyss along with Carmen. I looked at Carmen. I saw the desperation in her eyes, and the love she felt for her mother. And then I made a decision. No, I said firmly. There will be no deal. Carmen doesn't deserve this fate, but I will not sacrifice my soul for her. The judge nodded, as if he had expected that answer. Then the trial is concluded, he said, and with terrifying speed, the officers took Carmen and dragged her towards the door at the back of the room. I shouted. I tried to stop them, but I couldn't. Carmen disappeared behind that door, and all that was left was the echo of her sobbing. The weeks following Carmen's trial were a true torment. I couldn't stop thinking about her face, the desperation reflected in it, as the court officers dragged her towards that unknown fate. I had resigned myself to the idea that this cycle of dark pacts would never end. But something inside me kept pushing me to find answers, even though each step sank me deeper into the shadows. It wasn't until I received an unexpected visit that my search for answers took an even more sinister turn. I was in my office reviewing some routine cases when someone knocked on the door. "Come in," I said without looking up. As the door opened, I heard the sound of firm, calm footsteps. When I looked up, my heart skipped a beat. Standing before me was him, the opposing counsel I had seen in each of those trials in courtroom 66. He was there, in my office, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He wore the same impeccable black suit, the same malicious smile, and those eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Good afternoon, Javier," he said in that soft, serpentine voice that made my hair stand on end. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." I stood still for a moment, trying to process what was happening. How had he gotten here? Why was he looking for me outside the courtroom? "What are you doing here?" was all I could articulate, feeling tension take over my body. The man, though I was no longer sure I could call him a man, sat down with unsettling calm in the chair across from my desk. He crossed his legs and looked at me with an expression that mixed amusement and superiority. "I've come to talk to you, Javier, about your situation." "My situation?" I felt a wave of anger, but also fear. "What situation?" "I have nothing to do with your pacts," I replied with more bravery than I actually felt. He smiled, leaning slightly forward. "Ah, but you do. You've been deeply involved since the first trial, and I'm here to offer you something." My hands trembled slightly, but I tried to maintain my composure. "Offer me what?" I asked, knowing that any offer coming from him would not be good. "The deal is simple," he began, his tone calm but sharp. "You've been defending people who broke their pacts with me or my associates. Pacts that, as you well know, cannot be broken without consequences. However, I see potential in you. A talented lawyer like you could have a place in our system. You could, shall we say, switch sides." The air in the room seemed to grow denser with every word he spoke. Switch sides. The very idea of working for him, for the devil, was repulsive. But at the same time, a part of me was desperate to escape this infernal cycle of failures. "And what would I get in return?" I asked, trying not to show weakness. I knew I couldn't simply refuse without fully understanding what I was facing. The demonic lawyer smiled even wider, as if he had expected that question. "You would gain power, knowledge, and most importantly, you would no longer be on the losing side." How many times have you defended people who, deep down, you knew you couldn't save? You've faced forces beyond your comprehension, and you will continue to do so, unless you decide to join us. I was silent for a moment. His words felt like poison slowly entering my mind. I knew what he said was true. I had seen people like Don Manuel, Juan Garcia, and Carmen fall, one after another, and I had been unable to do anything to save them. This system, this court, was designed for me to always lose. However, a part of me could not accept the idea of joining them. I knew that working for him, no matter how tempting it seemed at that moment, would only condemn me further. But I also knew that refusing him would not be simple. "Thanks for the offer, but no," I replied, trying to keep my voice firm. "I'm not interested." The demonic lawyer leaned back, his expression changing slightly. There was no longer amusement on his face, only a cold disdain. "I knew you'd say that. But think it over, Javier. Opportunities like this don't come along every day. And I warn you, things will only get harder for you from now on." He stood up, straightening his suit, and began to walk toward the door. "I'll give you time to reconsider. We'll see each other soon, one way or another." And with those final words, he left my office, leaving behind a feeling of emptiness and desolation. That night I couldn't sleep. The lawyer's words echoed in my mind over and over. Was I truly doomed to keep losing? Was this a trap or a warning? The next morning, I decided I needed answers. I knew I couldn't go on like this, just reacting to the cases that came to me. If I wanted to break this cycle, I had to find the root of the problem. But the question was, where to begin? It was then that I remembered something Father Andres had told me after Carmen's case. He had mentioned a man in the mountains of Oaxaca, an old healer who, according to local legend, knew more about pacts with the devil than any other living person. I decided that would be my next step. If anyone could give me answers, it would be him. I traveled to Oaxaca again, this time alone, determined to find this man. After several hours of travel on winding, difficult roads, I arrived at a small town almost forgotten by time. I asked about the healer, and after some distrustful looks from the locals, an elderly man pointed me toward a cabin on the outskirts of town. When I arrived, I was met by an old man with piercing eyes. He seemed to have been expecting my arrival. "I knew you would come," he said in a deep voice, laden with wisdom. "You've been playing with forces you don't understand, and now you seek answers." I nodded silently, feeling that this man saw beyond what I myself could comprehend. "I need to know how to stop them," I said. "I need to know how to get out of this cycle." The old man smiled slightly, but not with joy. "You cannot stop what has already begun, my son. The court is just one part of the great system that governs the pacts. And you, Javier, have become an important piece in that game." I felt a chill run through me. "What does that mean? Why me?" The healer looked at me with compassion, but also with an unsettling resignation. "Because by opposing them, you have gained their attention. They consider you a threat, but also a potential ally. He has offered you a deal, hasn't he? The fact that he offered it means you are not a simple pawn in this game. You are someone who can influence the outcome. But you must be careful, Javier, because if you refuse his offer, things will only get worse." The weight of his words hit me like a hammer. There was no easy escape. I was trapped in this dark system, and my decisions not only affected my life, but also the lives of those I defended. "So what should I do?" I asked, with a feeling of hopelessness. The old man looked at me with a seriousness that made me feel the weight of what was to come. "You must prepare yourself, because the next trial you face will be different. And in it, he will not just be watching, he will be playing directly." The journey back from Oaxaca to Mexico City was heavy, not only because of the distance, but because of the burden I now carried with me. I knew I was at a crossroads much darker than I could have imagined. The healer had been clear. The next trial would not be like the previous ones. And this time, he would not be on the sidelines watching. He would be playing directly on the field. There was no way to fully prepare for what was coming, but I had to try. A few days passed, and although my mind tried to focus on my normal cases, I felt a shadow looming over me, waiting for the right moment to strike. That shadow finally materialized in the form of a letter, delivered by someone I don't recall ever seeing before, and from whom I never heard again. The letter contained an address, a date, and a name, Marta Sanchez. I was to appear at a place unknown to me, a courthouse on the outskirts of the city, in a building that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The date was in 3 days. I knew this was the trial the healer had warned me about. There was no turning back. I arrived at the building at the appointed time. The place was as gloomy as I could imagine, an old courthouse with worn columns and dirty windows that seemed to have seen centuries of desolation. There were no visible guards this time, which somehow made me even more nervous. I went up to the second floor, as the letter indicated, and there it was, Courtroom 66. This time its number was worn, as if it had been erased from overuse, but its presence was unmistakable. I entered, my heart pounding in my throat. The courtroom was, as always, a distorted mirror of any other court I had ever been in. However, this time the atmosphere was even heavier. The air seemed denser, darker. On one side, I saw a woman sitting, the same Marta Sanchez mentioned in the letter. She didn't seem different from the other people I had represented before, but there was something in her gaze that made me feel a profound sadness. Marta was there for something more than a broken pact. Across from her, as always, stood the opposing counsel. His impeccable suit and that presumptuous smile hadn't changed one bit. But there was something different about him too, as if this time he was even more confident of his victory. Judge Brian entered as usual, accompanied by the 2 court officers, those enormous beings who always caused me indescribable unease. But this time the courtroom was not empty. Off to one side, almost in the shadows, there was a figure I had never seen before. It was a tall man with a wide-brimmed black hat and a suit that looked old, from another era. His face was partially covered by shadows, but I could see his eyes shining with an almost supernatural intensity. I knew it instantly. That was him. The devil. The trial began like all the others. Judge Brian asked for the case to be presented. The opposing counsel, with that cold, serpentine voice, stood up and began to explain Marta's pact. According to him, she had made a deal 10 years ago. Her son had been born gravely ill, and she, desperate, had turned to all kinds of medical remedies and healers without success. Finally, in her darkest moment, he had offered to save her son's life in exchange for 10 years of her own life. Marta accepted without thinking. Her son recovered miraculously, and Marta lived those 10 years with him. But now her time was up. I tried to intervene, arguing that Marta, like others, had acted under duress, without truly understanding what that pact meant. But my words sounded hollow even to me. I knew there was no escape, but I also knew I had to fight for her. "Your Honor," I began, "this pact is not fair. It was made in a moment of desperation, and Marta was not in a condition to make such a definitive decision. Her son was saved, but she should not pay with her life for something that was offered to her under those circumstances." The opposing counsel interrupted me with a smile that deeply irritated me. "The pact is clear," he said, as if explaining something to a child. She understood the terms. 10 years of life for her son's life. It's simple. Judge Brian, showing no emotion, slowly nodded. The contract is legally binding. Mrs. Sanchez accepted the terms, and now she must fulfill her part of the deal. It was at that moment that the figure in the shadows, the devil, spoke for the first time. "Not so fast, Brian," he said in a voice that was both soft and threatening, like the sound of a snake slithering over dry leaves. "This trial is not as simple as the others." The whole room fell silent. Judge Brian, for the first time since I had known him, seemed surprised. The opposing counsel, although still smiling, was visibly unsettled. Something was about to change, and I didn't know if that would be good or bad for Marta, or for me. "The defense attorney has shown persistence," he continued, "and for that reason, I think it's fair to offer one last opportunity. A challenge." My heart began to beat wildly. I knew what was coming would not be a simple negotiation. "If the lawyer," he said, pointing at me, "manages to complete the challenge I propose, she will go free. But if he fails, not only will she lose, but you, Javier, will be part of the deal." I knew that, somehow, this had been planned from the beginning. He didn't just want the souls of those I defended. He wanted to drag me down too. "Do you accept?" His eyes shone with a malice he didn't try to hide. I looked at Marta. I saw in her eyes the pain and hope, a mixture that tore me apart inside. I knew that refusing the challenge would condemn Marta immediately, but accepting it meant putting myself in danger of losing much more than this case. "Yes," I replied, although my voice trembled. There was no other option. He smiled broadly, a smile that revealed the satisfaction of someone who knew the game was completely under his control. "Very well," he said. "The challenge is simple. You must face one of the oldest contracts and convince the forces that made it to break the agreement. You have 3 days." Before I could ask anything more, everything disappeared. The courtroom, the judge, the officers, even Marta, they all vanished. I found myself alone, standing in the middle of a dark, silent void. I knew the coming days would be a struggle against forces I had never faced before, and that in the end, he would be waiting to claim what he believed was his. The darkness I found myself in enveloped me like a heavy blanket. There were no walls, no floor, no sky, only an endless void. In the distance, I could hear an echo, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I knew it was him, watching me, waiting for the outcome of this challenge he had proposed. I had 3 days to resolve one of the oldest contracts in existence, one that, according to him, not even the forces that made it could easily break. He had given no further details. He had only left me in this void with the responsibility of saving not only Marta, but also my own soul. Finally, the darkness began to recede. I felt myself regaining form, regaining a body. The place around me began to materialize. I was not in a courtroom or a hearing room. I was standing in what appeared to be an ancient church. But not just any church. It was old, deteriorated, with walls full of cracks and a dense air that carried centuries of suffering. The stained glass windows were broken, and the light that came through them seemed more like shadow than clarity. In front of me, on the altar, I saw something that froze my blood. A contract. It was a long, worn parchment scroll, so old it almost seemed to crumble at the touch of the air. I knew this was the contract he had spoken of. This was the challenge. I approached cautiously, feeling that each step brought me closer to the edge of an abyss from which there might be no return. The contract was open, and although I didn't understand the language it was written in, I could feel the weight of what it represented. "You know what you must do," said a voice behind me. I turned around, and there he was again, the opposing counsel. His face, although familiar, seemed sharper, more unsettling than I remembered. He was here to make sure I failed. "This contract," he said, pointing to the parchment, was written centuries ago. It is one of the first pacts he made, long before you or any other soul came into this world. It is sealed with a force you cannot comprehend. If you think you can simply break it, you are very mistaken. I knew he was telling the truth. This was not a simple legal contract that could be voided with a technical argument or a loophole. This pact was different. I felt its roots were buried in something deeper, in the very forces that govern life and death. How do I break it, then? The opposing counsel smiled maliciously. Ah, there's the trick, isn't it? The only way to break this contract is to understand the sacrifice it entails. Sacrifice. That word echoed in my head. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew he wouldn't give me a way out without me paying a high price. What is the sacrifice? I insisted. The lawyer walked slowly around the altar, touching the contract with his fingertips as if admiring it. This contract was sealed with the sacrifice of a life. One life for another. That is the essence of the pact. The only way to break it is to offer a life in exchange for another. I felt the air leave my lungs. The price of breaking the contract was someone's life. And I knew deep in my being that the life I would have to offer was my own. If you break the contract, the opposing counsel continued, Marta will be free. But you will be condemned. There is no way to escape that. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. I thought of Marta, of her son, of everything she had done to save him. I thought of all the people I had defended before, Don Manuel, Juan Garcia, Carmen. They had all fallen to these pacts, unable to escape the infernal cycle he had created. And now I was facing the most difficult decision of my life. Was I willing to sacrifice myself for Marta? Was I willing to condemn myself so that she could live? I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to find some answer within myself. But the answer was already there, latent. I knew what I had to do. I approached the contract with trembling hands. I could feel the power emanating from it, the weight of centuries of darkness that surrounded it. And then, without hesitating further, I signed my name in a place where there had been no space to do so before. The opposing counsel smiled triumphantly. You have made your choice. At that moment, everything changed. The air around me became dense and suffocating. I felt a pull inside me, as if something was being ripped from me. The pain was unbearable, but I knew there was no turning back. I had sealed my fate. The contract began to glow intensely, as if it were being consumed by an invisible flame. The parchment disintegrated in my hands, turning to ashes that scattered across the church floor. The pact had been broken. I fell to my knees powerless, feeling my body weaken. I knew what was coming. My time was over. But at that instant, a faint light filled the church. It was not a warm or comforting light, but it was enough to illuminate the shadows. Before me, I saw Marta standing, free, with tears in her eyes. I knew she was safe. Thank you, was all she managed to say before disappearing into that light, leaving the church empty. The opposing counsel approached me. His smile had disappeared. You made your choice, he said quietly. And now you must pay the price. The void began to surround me again. I knew I had lost my soul. It no longer belonged to me. He had one. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet began to vanish, and I felt myself falling faster than I could comprehend. I fell towards an endless abyss, a place where time and space did not exist, a place destined for those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Just before losing consciousness, I heard one last voice. The voice of the devil. We'll see each other again, Javier. This is only the beginning.